presentation about 6 months ago, a 15-minute presentation somewhere, and Kath saw it and she said, I wonder if you could do something like that. I've taken that. The presentation is, should we be optimistic about the future of work? I've completely dismantled it. There's about 4 slides that are the same, but I've tried to sort of lean into what we've seen since and how we can explore it. So I'm going to try and answer that question. I believe, personally, for everyone in this room, this could be a good opportunity. We're about to enter a really good moment. So slight spoiler there. I thought to kick off, I would survey where we are and the situation we're currently in. And so I would do this by sharing some, later on, I don't take offense if you don't want this or not, but later on, I'm going to show you some slides that you might want to steal. And I will give you the QR code at that stage and at the end. So you decide as the presentation's going on, but if you want to steal the slides, you might want to grab that QR code later. Right, I'm going to start with a little bit of context. I'm going to start with some HR issues that I saw online. Here's the first one. This was a genuine email. If you search this out, the company tried to do a bit of backpedaling when it happened, but I'm going to read this to you. The title of the email is Update on Stress Survey Results, and I've anonymised the sender. If you search online, you will see who sent this. Dear team, recently we conducted a survey to understand your feelings about stress at work. As a company committed to sustaining a healthy workplace, we have considered the feedback. To ensure that no one remains stressed at work, we have made the difficult decision to part ways with those employees who indicated significant stress. I think they've solved it. I think they've solved the burnout crisis. We just, in a sort of Hunger Games style, we just fire everyone who is burnt out. Here's another one for you. I think this one just illustrates the complexities of modern workplace. The guy who started today is clearly not the guy we interviewed, and no one else has noticed. And that goes on to talk about the challenges that the person who came for the coding review, the coding interview, isn't the person who's turned up for his new hire first meeting. Work's far more complicated now than it used to be. Here's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about 3 things. I'm going to talk about how workers have changed, how work is changing, and why culture is the answer. So that's the potential uplift in the context of how we should be thinking about the future of work. So let's go into that. Let's think about how workers have changed. And some of this stuff is going to be the stuff that you might want to have a look at and have a look at the data on. In fact, it's not showing very well here, so I'm going to come and sort of talk you through this slide. Now, this is some work that you might have seen. There's a fabulous data journalist at the Financial Times, a guy called John Murdoch. He became quite an iconic name during COVID because he did a lot of the COVID chart that sort of followed the trajectory of COVID. And he's published something here. I'm going to come to each screen and talk you through it. He talked through how some aspects of personality were changing. Now, the reason why this matters is that we're probably all familiar with the idea of Myers-Briggs, but far more robust than Myers-Briggs. Myers-Briggs is sometimes called work horoscopes because it's not that predictive. And I guarantee by the very fact I've said that, a Myers-Briggs practitioner will come to me in the break and try and talk to me until I give up and concede. But Myers-Briggs, sometimes called work horoscopes, whereas the big 5, the attributes that psychologists call the big 5, are normally far more predictive of personality. And these are conscientiousness, neuroticism, agreeableness, extroversion, and openness. Right, so these 5 things. Now, the reason why this is interesting, I'm going to talk you through these charts, but the reason why this is interesting is typically we don't change massively in these things. So, for example, to elicit an answer in conscientiousness, you would answer the question, I always go through with the things that I've committed to do. If I start a project, I will always complete on it. We answer these things and they're pretty consistent. What happens over time is we become a touch more conscientious as we get older, and we become a touch less extroverted as we get older. So we know that there is a bit of change, but broadly our patterns are the same. Now, the reason why this is of interest is because John Murdoch published some data that suggested conscientiousness is plummeting amongst under 40s, but plummeting amongst everyone. So we're sort of seeing these big falls. This is the chart here. We're seeing these big falls of people's conscientiousness. In addition, when you look at the other charts, neuroticism with extroversion, we're seeing changes in those things. We're seeing people are becoming a touch less extroverted, and they're becoming, their agreeableness is falling slightly. So I'll just come over and point it out for this screen because I thought it might be a bit clearer. So this is the conscientiousness falling amongst the young people. It's falling amongst everyone, and agreeableness, extroversion falling. Really interesting, because if we ask ourselves, what are the components of good workplace culture? Then these things are actually highly predictive. Conscientiousness is very predictive of school results, of maths results, of GCSE and A-level results. Conscientiousness is really predictive. So if we're seeing a fall in that, then it suggests that actually is going to have an impact on how people do their jobs. In fact, look, I actually pulled out those data so you can see them a bit more clearly there. So you can see a big fall there and changes there, agreeableness falling. It raises really interesting questions. There's always a danger when people start looking into demographics that we fall into generational blaming, that we start thinking that young people are made of a worse fabric than people are today. And I'd be cautious making that conclusion. But what I would say is that there is a little bit of evidence that suggests that we possibly need to think about the societal changes that are ongoing now. One thing that I always think of is that psychologists will say this to you. They'll say, the first group we were ever part of was our family. In fact, we learn as much about compromise and about being part of a team on the sofa in the living room or around the kitchen table as we do anywhere else. And the reason why that is important is because I think there's lessons passed down to us that there have been changes in the last 15 years that are making circumstances different. If you conceive of maybe a period 15 years ago, most of the TV in your family was possibly watched by everyone sitting together and choosing a show. And so you learn that you've got to put up with something, compromise. Compromise is where everyone gets what they didn't ask for, right? We learn that we end up, we're watching something we don't want to watch, but kind of being together was important. TV now is principally consumed by people sitting alone and watching their screens in their rooms. Really interesting. That has a direct consequence of how we think about things. So kind of skipping forwards, but there's a really interesting bit of data that probably the world's leading expert on teenage mental well-being, a woman called Jean Twenge, she had. And she explored during the pandemic, early pandemic. She wanted to understand the changes going on with young people. And she gets this sort of panel data that she loads in and analyses. One of the things that she presumed, she was looking at the first 3-4 months of the pandemic. She presumed, because she was looking at this data a year on, that anxiety would be up, that depression would be up, that resilience would be down. In fact, she found the exact opposite. For the first 3 or 4 months of the pandemic, resilience was much higher, anxiety was much lower. I know it changed afterwards, but she discovered that principally that was just amongst people who are teenagers who were having evening meals with their families every night. When they were actually probably for the first time in their teenage years, when they were having an evening meal with their families every night, they were sort of showing greater resilience. You know, it's a recurrent theme I often talk about. Resilience is the strength we draw from each other. So like, actually, these things are really important. So our first group used to be our family. That's not necessarily the same way it used to be. There's also a fabulous journalist at the Atlantic, sort of an American broadsheet style publication, but in magazine form. And he did a guy called Derek Thompson, he did some great analysis this year. He said that on average, we are spending about 100 minutes, 99 minutes a day more alone than we used to. Now, that maybe then is reflected in that extroversion going down. It may be reflected in we're kind of less used to being around other people. So look, that I think is a context. It doesn't predetermine any outcomes, but it just means that our starting point might have to be in a different place. If we're trying to illustrate to team members the benefit of being part of a team, we can't necessarily presume an understanding of those things from day one. So next, work is changing. Now look, there's going to be a lot of discussions about AI today. there's a lot written about these things. I saw this report that was quite eye-catching for me. I don't necessarily believe that, and again, I've linked to this if you get the QR code at the end. I don't necessarily believe that everything in this report is exactly right. So this report was called AI 2027. It was named that because the person who wrote it used to be a former analyst at OpenAI. So he did some forecasts 5 years ago. A guy called Daniel Kokotajlo. He did some forecasts about 5 years ago, and they've pretty much proved correct, give or take a month or two, for the last 5 years. So when he published some new predictions this year, everyone was interested in what he was saying. The interesting thing is that in the time since he was hired by OpenAI, he went to work for OpenAI, he started doing their projections. He left, actually. He felt that Sam Altman didn't show high moral integrity, and he chose to leave. But so everyone was interested in what this guy was going to say. And the really interesting thing about this, if I was going to summarize this report for you, and look, it's just one person's perspective. You can choose to listen to it as a podcast if you're interested. For me, it just made me think of one particular thing. And to try and sort of shortcut it, I'll just give you the metaphor of Wembley Stadium and the hose pipe. So you might know this metaphor. The metaphor of this is this: that there's Wembley Stadium, and we've got a scenario. We've got a little maths puzzle on our hand. There's a hose pipe running at the side of the pitch. And in the first minute of the game, a single drop of water comes out of this hose pipe. It doubles every minute. So the second minute, 2 drops of water. In the third minute, 4 drops of water. Now, how many hours, how many days, how many weeks do you believe it will take for the water to cascade over the roof of Wembley Stadium onto the hot dog sellers below? It takes 43 minutes for the water to fill Wembley Stadium and overload. And broadly, the lesson of that is we don't understand exponential growth, is that things creep along and then they suddenly explode. And so what Daniel Kokotajlo says in his report is he says that at the moment that AI surpasses human intellect, then it's not just going to carry on incrementally improving like a little bit. At that stage, the AI starts programming itself, and he said we'll be getting about a year's worth of progress every week. Right. Okay. So your company 5-year plan might need a bit of analysis. No, look, whether it's right or whether it's wrong, it immediately made me reflect on the preconceptions, the prejudices that I was bringing to that analysis. A really interesting analysis. And look, probably the best person I find to follow on AI is a guy called Ethan Mollick. I think I've linked to him in the show notes. He's a professor at Wharton. But for example, he did some analysis he published earlier this year where Procter & Gamble, the big sort of packaged goods company, they did a live experiment with the old version of ChatGPT. It might have been ChatGPT 3.5. And they found that a current person working in partnership with AI, was as productive as 2 people. In fact, the really interesting thing is the best ideas came from a group plus ChatGPT. But we're already, if people are applying these things just in mundane ways, we're already seeing a benefit. The reason why any of that preamble is of interest is that I don't think we've extrapolated the consequences. Microsoft released a really interesting report this year. It's called the Work Trends Index, and they do this every year. Until now, it's been like, oh yeah, I get that, I understand that. They talked last year about, 2 years ago, about AI solves the workplace demon of the blank page. Oh, I get it, relatable, sort of helps me with a first draft. This year they did something different. Their Work Trends Index describes a completely different version of work. They say a version of work that is no longer relying on the org chart. It's far more reliant on very rapid deployment of project teams. In fact, so I chatted to one person and he said, you're going to go to an era where having 30 hours a week of standing meetings suddenly becomes a disadvantage rather than an advantage. Right? Sort of quite a jarring thought. But they use this phrase. They say, we're going to enter an era where intelligence on tap will rewire business. Now, based on the idea that we've been underestimating some of the change that's there, this begs a slightly different question for me, because if you work in an organisation that's got competitors in your space, And everyone is doing, you know what a lot of us are starting to do now? We've got a challenge. We ask, in the way that we might have Googled something before, we go and ask AI what the thoughts are on this. Actually, what you can end up very quickly is that AI ceases to be a point of advantage. It starts being just a point of continuity amongst everyone faced with the same challenge. That what's to stop your competitor in their situation asking for an outline of a marketing plan, asking for an outline of a comms document? What's to stop them asking the same question and getting pretty much the same thing back? And what you realise very quickly is that actually if you extrapolate that, if you do that thought of experiment of thinking about not just next year, but the next, what's the consequence of it after that, you reach a conclusion that the only differentiator going forwards is going to be culture. It's going to be the human layer that we lay on top. For me, like, culture is organisational programming, but I love this definition, because this definition sort of helps us think about the impact of culture in our business. I love this. Culture is the behaviour that happens in organisations, whether encouraged, rewarded or tolerated. The reason why I love that is it gives you three levers to think about. It gives you three things to think about. I think your eyes immediately go to that tolerated thing, don't they? You know, when a culture's gone wrong, it's normally because something has been tolerated. Maybe because there's a power inequality and something's been tolerated that maybe it shouldn't. But for me, if we start thinking about culture as organisational programming, we start thinking about, well, what is the way that we want to differentiate versus our competitors? What are the ways we're encouraging this or rewarding it or tolerating it? What can we do differently? Right, so I'm going to get in and sort of think a little bit about culture and what it means. Broadly, I tend to think that when I work with organisations, I chat to people, good culture is when people feel part of something. They feel included. A shared sense of identity, I think, is really important for me, but they feel part of something. There was a really interesting piece of work done by an organisation called Work Vivo that's part of Zoom. And they published some work about 3 or 4 months ago. And they talked about frontline workers, and they said that 87% of frontline workers don't believe that the company culture applies to them. So they think that company culture is something that head office has, or you know, the management team have, but it's not about them. What's really interesting is that you ask them, quite often they'll say, I really love my team. I feel part of something, but I feel part of like this sort of rebel alliance versus my team. Like, we've got our own culture around here, not allowed to admit it, but that's what we've got. So the nub of something in there, those microcultures are often so much more completely felt than the macro culture. And actually the secret is if we can tap into those things and make them the same. But they don't necessarily feel that everything's together and part for them. Right, so I've given you a context. I've given you a context that workers have changed. I've given you a context that work has changed. I want to sort of reflect on how we should think about this going forward. There's a real danger, I think, when we're thinking about change, that we kind of recede into our shells and we sort of think that everything's terrible. And as an attempt to guide us to change that perspective, I want to suggest that we follow the Douglas Adams rules of technology. Now, the Douglas Adams rules of technology, I'm going to admit, I've never read a Douglas Adams book. He wrote Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. You know, like clever people like Stephen Fry really love this guy. But I love his rules to technology because these, I think, are an important maxim that we can all take on board. Here's his rules. So the first rule is that anything that's in the world when we are born is normal. Okay, we'll get that right. Sort of, sometimes you witness it through kids now, or you witness it a bit in yourself. Anything that's invented between when you were 15 and 35 is new and exciting. Anything invented after you're 35 is the beginning of the end of civilization as we know it. And there's some truth in that, right? There's some truth. When new things come along, we're like, yeah, that's not going to pass around here. The amount of, I witnessed it a generation ago. There was a generation of bosses who didn't do email. And I don't do email. don't do email, print it off for me, don't do email. And like, it was just this notion that actually their identity was so important, this power that they had. They weren't going to compromise, they weren't going to obey any technology that was coming along that was disruptive for them. In fact, it's really interesting when you sort of immerse yourself in the worlds of technology, it poses these really interesting challenges. It's like, what would anyone advise kids to learn now? You know, I heard someone saying, well, my mum spent decades telling me I should have learned coding, and I'm glad I didn't learn coding now. That will show you, Mum. And sort of this idea of pushing back. Sam Altman was asked what he would advise kids to learn. And he said he would advise them to focus on soft skills. Back to that idea that the differentiation is going to be culture, the ability to interact with other people, to take on board what they're saying, maybe to sort of respond to that is really critical. And that's why I'm convinced that actually if we're thinking about where work's going, culture is not only set in a good place, but it's most definitely the answer to what a lot of our problems are. I'm sort of enter into a bit of discussion, a bit of reflection. Quite often, I spent some time sort of researching resilience, and actually what you discover about good workplace culture, it's got a lot in common with the idea of being collectively resilient. Before I sort of talk about resilience is this really interesting thing that a lot of people inside their organisation might have had the boss saying, it's going to be a tough year ahead, we need to tell them they've got to be more resilient. And, or, you know, given a mate of mine, I used to work in big technology companies. I used to work at Google for about 4 years, and I worked at Twitter for 4 years. Before that guy, I worked there before that guy. And but anyway, a friend of mine at Google got sent on a resilience course, and because I was obsessed with resilience and I said, how was it? She said, it's awful, far worse than you can ever imagine, because I was feeling pretty bad before. My boss sent me on a resilience course that didn't work. And now my boss keeps asking if everything's better. And so I have to say that everything's better. It was better when I was just getting no attention. Now I don't want my boss thinking the problem is me rather than anyway. And that's not a unique issue. A lot of money spent on resilience. Resilience, the idea that we can bounce back from things, that we can sort of re-energize after a setback. And the biggest customer for that is the US Army. The US Army spent over $1 billion creating a resilience program, implementing the resilience program, specifically because they've got this sort of strange situation that when combat soldiers are in service, when they're in the front line or whatever, they exhibit really high levels of strength, of resilience. But the moment they retire, their addiction levels are off the charts. You're far more likely to encounter a serviceman living homeless on the streets. In fact, more combat soldiers die from their own hands than die in service. It's absolutely horrific. And because it became such a big issue, the US Army spent a load of money. They got loads of psychologists to come along, and probably big names of psychologists you've heard of, to design a program. And the interesting thing about that is that when you have a program like that created, a lot of other people will come along and say, can we measure if it worked? And the people who measured it said, there is zero evidence the program does anything to help soldiers. Interestingly, it was based on work that was done in schools. And the great thing about that is that you don't even have to deal with getting through and interviewing combat soldiers. You can see whether it's from Holland to China to Australia to the UK, US. Hundreds of schools have implemented that. And the people who've researched that said there's no evidence it had any impact at all. A guy came to fix my Wi-Fi. And that's not the story. He came to fix my Wi-Fi, and he imparted a bit of workman wisdom in me. He said, I can fix Wi-Fi, by the way. I'm able to deal with it, but it was a big issue. And sometimes you just got to get someone to help you, but I can do, I'm not that guy, I can fix the printer, I can do those things. But he said, never in the history of calming down has someone calmed down by being told to calm down. And resilience is a bit like that. Never in the history of resilience has someone been resilient because your boss sent an email around saying you need to be more resilient next quarter. Right, so I want to sort of reflect, because I think the answers to resilience are really important when it comes to thinking about building culture set to last in the future. I want to suggest to you that resilience is the strength we draw from each other. And it's very easy to lose sight of this. But if you think back to those kids who were now having an evening meal with their families, and that previously had maybe been going to sit in their rooms, that sense of connection, that sense of being around people who understand us, even if it can be uncomfortable in the moment, is a really important lesson about how we can create and be part of more resilient cultures. I'm going to break it down a little bit more. I'm going to break it down into a touch more specifics, but I think that's the important maxim I'd give. And actually, if you think about that, the resilience is the strength we draw from each other. I'm not suggesting the answer to that for work is that we need to be in the office 5 days a week, far from it. But we need to be a bit more intentional about how we turn up for each other, or how we make sure we forge connections, we make people feel part of things. I'm going to give you a couple more components. So if I was going to talk about resilience, I would say that, look, resilience, think about it in three ways. Think about control, community and identity, where community is what I've just talked about, the idea that we draw strength from each other. But let me give you the other couple of components. The first thing is that anything in terms of human well-being, the biggest contributor to us having a sense of well-being is whether we feel like we have any agency over what's happening to us. So if control exists on a spectrum where at one extreme we have no control, we're in a state of helplessness, and the other end, we've got full control over what's happening to us. And typically, so this is an individual contributor to a sense of resilience, but typically when we feel like we're in control of what's happening to us, it gives us a sense that things are going well, that we're performing well. And so for a lot of us, a lot of our life doesn't give us much control, actually, whether it's a lack of financial control and we feel overwhelmed by the circumstances, or maybe a bit of lack of control in our relationship, that we feel like we're constantly doing what other people want, or in our work. And I think work increasingly has served over the last 15 years to rob us of any sense of agency. So you might open your calendar and you've got back-to-back meetings. People are just spotting a gap in your diary, and like snipers, they're sending a meeting to just take that little bit of space. I was just going to go to Boots, and all of a sudden that's gone. And robbing you of any sense of control is a really critical thing. There was a lovely piece of work actually done in Scotland tracking Scottish nurses. And it just goes to show, I loved this because it shows how the mind plays tricks on us. So they tracked the Scottish nurses for about 2 months, and they put effectively Apple Watches on them. They tracked their heart rate, their stress, all manner of things. In the course of those 2 months, all of those nurses ended up doing double shifts. So that is, you turn up for work at 8 a.m. and you go home tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. Now, the interesting thing about that is that the stress levels of the nurses was highly variable when that happened to them. But the difference was, sometimes the nurses had chosen to do a double shift. So the week before, someone said, we've got no cover on Tuesday night, and someone thinks, opportunity to earn a bit of overtime there actually, and I've got that holiday coming up, I'm going to do that. Those nurses who'd chosen to do the double shift, yes, they were tired, they were exhausted, they went home and slept, but their stress levels hadn't gone up. And our mind plays tricks on us. When we feel like we've chosen to do something, it's really protective for us. So you might hear, I often hear people talk about burnout, and it'll be people who own their own business. And they say, burnout doesn't apply to me. I can work whenever I want. And it's because we feel like we've got the agency over what's happening to us. But when we don't feel that, that's when we feel helpless. We feel like we're robbed of any sort of sense of ownership of what's happening. So look, I can't underestimate, there are individual components, and a sense of control is a critical part. Look, for modern work, knowing what we can control and what we can't is the really important out for us. Knowing that thing I've booked in my own calendar on Wednesday, I'm definitely doing that. I'm definitely leaving on time on Tuesday. 100%. And the more that we can gift people ownership there, the more it liberates them and gives them that sense of resilience. Second part is identity, and often overlooked. I saw this absolutely fantastic thing, and I've put it in the notes. Identity plays a really big part in who we are and how we feel respected, how we turn up for work. For me, I'll give you my own. My grandmother was German, and so if you've ever got anyone who doesn't either you were born in a different place, you got a relative born in a different place. Identity is a really important part of how they want to bring you up. My grandmother, it was really important that she would insist I eat as much German sausage as possible. She introduced me to sauerkraut when I was about 4.5. I remember crying. So I'm a vegetarian now. I don't like the amount of sausage she forced upon me. It was like, we eat sausage in this family. A really big part, identity plays a bit, or another part, is my dad was really sick when I was a kid. And so I've got this broken part of me, if you understand me, the broken part of me, whereas I'm convinced the answer to life is me working harder all the time. And it's a broken thing in me. And it's because when you've witnessed something like that, it sort of goes in, becomes a part of who you are. Broken, really bad, I can't change it. But identity plays a really important part of how we see ourselves and how we see other people seeing us. I saw this brilliant thing, and I've included it in the deck if you take it afterwards, of this guy, Nick Shackleton-Jones, talking about the role of identity in return to office mandates. And this guy, he says, I'm going to summarise it. He says, the reason why your boss wants you back in the office is because middle-aged men don't like their wives. And what he says it's really interesting. He says, what you've effectively got is that even though your boss pretends to be quite cool and down with it, in the office they're shown respect. People laugh at their jokes. People ask them if they can have a quick coffee to pick their brains. People sort of get out of their meeting rooms when they're in there. Everyone showers them with deference and respect. When they're at home, the kids don't listen to them. The kids don't keep quiet. They're asked to empty the dishwasher. Does no one know who I am? Like, their identity is compromised, and it's a big part. I fully buy this. Whether it's the full answer or not, our identity, the role of how we are perceived plays a really big part in our well-being. And it sort of leads into this. Anyone who is interested in culture will know the first thing from the Gallup Workplace Survey, first thing that predicts whether we're engaged with our jobs, you'll know this well, is whether we have a best friend at work. And whenever I show that chart, I always think of this, and it's possible I showed this when I spoke a couple of years ago, but it's because it's something that unpicks that for me. It's a bit of poetry by a guy called David White. And actually, if you go to this poem, it's like a sort of a page of prose, but it's like these beautiful reflections on, it's a poem about friendship, beautiful reflections. He says, friendship is the privilege of having been seen by someone and the equal privilege of having been granted the sight of the essence of another. I don't think I could have handled that a couple of hours ago before I had that scone, but now I've taken that scone on board, I feel like, yeah, that's making a lot of, like, when we're trying, it seems so trivial to say having a friend at work matters, but I think it goes to the heart of identity. It goes to the heart of feeling seen and understood by someone. There's another stat actually in the Gallup Workplace Survey, which is this. Engaged workers, 80% of engaged workers received direct feedback in their job last week. And for a long time, I've thought about those things. And then I read this sensational book this year called The Power of Mattering by a guy called Zach Mercurio. And he gave me this phrase, exists, long-term phrase, it's existed in psychology for 50 years, but I think it captures both of those things. It captures why identity matters. He says, this is the concept of mattering. And mattering is the feeling or belief that we are significant to others. And I think right at the heart of great cultures, the reason why identity matters is that sense that we matter plays a fundamental part in how we experience our jobs. The idea that document we spent a week preparing that no one seems to have opened, or those handover notes that no one even looked at. You know, when we feel like we don't matter, when we feel like we're not being taken seriously, I think it plays a really big part in our experience of work. So look, I've talked about control, I've talked about identity. The final part is that idea that we do draw strength from each other, and the idea that a good culture is a sense that we feel part of something. You know, the idea that we sort of get the benefit out of these things. And look, there's a real danger, I guess, in the current climate that a boss might look at this and go, well, it's time to get everyone back in the office. It's time to, if connection with each other is so important, we need to do that and sort of try and set about having more face-to-face time. I don't think that's the answer personally. There's some really interesting societal changes that have gone on. People live far further from the office now than they did 10, 15 years ago. The cost of housing, there's a website called Spare Room that possibly some people in the room might have used, but definitely others will never have thought of it. But Spare Room helps you find somewhere to live in sort of house share. And Spare Room say there isn't a single postcode in London that is affordable on a graduate salary. And so when your boss is saying, well, in my day, we'd just, it'd be good to come into the office because that's where the buzz is, and why would you want to be at home? They're not reckoning with the fact that it costs you 12 quid to get here from Croydon, it costs you 12 quid to get here from Watford. They're not reckoning on the fact that people are living far further away now than they were. And so the answer isn't necessarily that we should be in the office every day, but it should be that we think about how can we create a sense of mattering when people are together. There's nothing that kills the office more than people making the journey in, spending £12, then buying a sandwich. They're sort of 25 quid down and they sit on Teams calls all day, and nothing kills the idea that I was meant to come in for culture more than really struggling with this. I worked with one organisation and because the peak of people travelling in on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday was so big, people were taking calls sitting in the corridor. It was like being on an intercity train on a Friday evening on Christmas Eve. It was like this horrific experience. Now look, I'm not saying that's the answer, but I am saying thinking about how you can create those community moments is really critical. Recognising there is some benefit to face-to-face that should be tapped into. I've mentioned it before, but I love the example of Crisp Thursday, and it's a perennial favourite for me because it's got many layers to this. I worked with one organisation, about 50, 60 people. The receptionist said, "This is the worst place I've ever worked in my life." And no one listened to her. She was an actor. She used to do like 3 months acting, then turn back. She said it again, no one listened to her. So she sent an email around the company. She said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you to the best time of the week. It's Crisp Thursday." And what she'd done, she'd gone out and bought 4 tubes of Pringles, 4 bags of kettle chips, and she'd laid them on paper plates in the middle of the office. No one knew where it was, but you're not going to say no to a little mini stack of Pringles, are you? 4:30. So people went over, they took a little stack of Pringles. What's this about? No idea. She did it the next week. The third week, I love it, because she leaned into the bit and she dressed as a Pringles tube. And along the way, she'd do like little, for Chinese New Year, she'd do Chinese snacks. She really leaned into it. Anyway, normally in a culture, the rituals tell you what matter in that culture. So, for example, I used to know someone who used to work at one of the biggest legacy tech firms. He said all that mattered in that company was knowing your numbers. So all of the rituals are about, all the meetings are about numbers, all of the quarterly reviews are about numbers. You got promoted if you knew your numbers. The rituals of organisations signal what matter to an organisation. And so establishing this ritual, Thursday afternoon, no one knows why we do it, but we gather and we have a few snacks together, is a ritual about connection. It's a ritual, if you could try and sort of build a culture, find what already exists and lean into it. And it was a ritual about connection and coming together. What I loved about that story was that a few months after they'd set it up and they'd got this going, this receptionist with zero power had set this up. And they had a change of chief exec. They were part of like a big multinational media group. And the chief exec sent an email, a meeting invite for 4:30 on Thursday. And what I love about it is that rituals can become self-policing. And there was more than a handful of them said, well, someone's got to tell him. We do not have meetings at 4:30 on Thursday. And it became something that was self-sustaining. They stopped it, they changed it, the meeting was moved. Great cultures have that. Rituals signal these things, but great cultures have that sense that we're all in it together, that we're part of something, we're connected. So look, if I'm going to summarise, I think there is a lot of noise, there's a lot of data out there, there's a lot of evidence that society is changing. I've done a lot of work with the NHS and they say the hostility they have from people is much higher than they used to have. Anyone who works in retail will tell you the world is different than it was before. And I think you can end up thinking, you can feel sort of woeful and feel that like, well, there's no answer to this, you know, everything's going to get worse. But actually, I think the critical thing is for businesses who recognise this and say, okay, so when it comes to building cultures, we're going to start from an earlier point. We're going to make sure that we teach team members the benefit of feeling part of something. We're going to maybe lean into a bit more training of people that tries to build a sense of cohesion amongst the younger workers, that tries to sort of foster a sense of connection or mentorship, that make people recognise the benefits, that we don't take it for granted that people know with that, that comes baked in. But the critical thing is that I think, you know, if we do imagine that Wembley Stadium, we do imagine exponential change, it does beg an interesting question for us, our businesses, about what are we going to do differently. My favourite thing about being interested in culture is watching it in the wild. And the best places to watch culture are supermarkets, retail stores, restaurants. Because sometimes you go into a restaurant, if you've ever worked in a restaurant or bar, you go into a restaurant and you go, I'd love to work here. It looks like a proper buzz. Look at these people. I'd love to work here. And sometimes you go in and you go, not only is that waiter miserable and he's ruining my night, but I think that waiter is just a reflection of this is a horrible, toxic place. I'm not convinced there are bad people. They're just bad systems and bad places. And it's just great to watch. You can see those things taking place. I think increasingly going forward, it's going to be a bigger and bigger differentiator. That as we find that everything potentially can be part of this homogenous, consistent part of the computer has produced answers, the things that are going to differentiate, the things that really connect with us is where you get a magical connection with other people. And that is something that culture is all about. So look, I'm really confident that for the right places and the places and the leaders that invest in these things, that culture is a big differentiator and a big opportunity. And that's why, look, you know, from my perspective, people who are in this room, for culture builders, this is your moment. This is a big opportunity to have a big impact on business. Thank you. Like I say, all of my slides and data are on there. Thank you.